Welcome to Life Stories. In today's story, we explore the journey of a single mother, Emma, who is forced to face the painful past at her sister-in-law's wedding. With her son, Ben, by her side, Emma navigates the humiliation of being judged by her ex-husband's family, only to discover the strength within herself and her child to stand up for what is right. It's a story of resilience, love, and the power of truth. Stay tuned as we unfold the lessons of courage and transformation. Subscribe to our channel to start the story today. I stood by the window of my small apartment in the heart of Boston, watching the morning sun spill its golden light across the worn wooden floors. The world outside seemed so vibrant, yet my own life felt heavy, weighed down by years of struggle. As I took a sip of coffee, the warmth of the mug in my hands felt oddly comforting, like a brief moment of peace amid a life that had often been anything but peaceful. It was a quiet morning, just like any other, but today felt different. Today was Sarah's wedding, my sister-in-law's big day. I didn't want to go. In fact, I had been dreading it for weeks. But Ben, my son, had asked me to take him. His excitement, his innocent joy at the idea of seeing his father again after so long, made it impossible to say no. Ben was only 8, but his emotional maturity was beyond his years. He understood the complexities of life, even when I wished he didn't. "Mom, I can't tie my tie." Ben's voice rang out from the living room. I smiled despite myself. He had a red tie draped awkwardly around his neck, his little hands fumbling with the fabric. "Hang on, sweetie, I'll help you," I called back. As I made my way to the living room, I found him standing in front of the mirror, a mixture of frustration and determination on his face. I knelt down and gently took the tie from his hands. "See? It's a bit tricky, but I'll show you," I said softly, my fingers moving deftly to fix the knot. As I worked, my mind wandered, and I couldn't help but think about the events that had brought me to this moment. My heart tightened as I thought of Sarah's wedding and what it meant. 3 years ago, my world had crumbled. When I discovered Mark's affair with his young secretary, I felt as though the ground had been ripped out from under me. Mark had always been ambitious, climbing the corporate ladder with ease, but I hadn't known that his rising career would one day outgrow our marriage. I was just a waitress at a local diner, working long hours to provide for Ben. To him, I had become a reflection of failure. "I want a divorce," he had told me one night, his voice cold. I hadn't cried. I had simply nodded, signed the papers, and packed my things. With Ben in tow, I moved back into my parents' home, determined to give him the love and security he needed. "Mom, today is Aunt Sarah's wedding. Remember? We need to be extra polite," Ben said, pulling me from my thoughts. His words were spoken with such sincerity that I couldn't help but smile. I ruffled his hair affectionately. "I know, sweetheart. We'll be on our best behavior. I promise." But despite my best intentions, my thoughts kept returning to my former in-laws. Sarah, with her perfect life, her prestigious education, and her perfect fiancé. And then there was Linda, her mother, who had always looked down on me. To her, I was nothing more than a lowly waitress, someone who didn't fit into their world of high society and elite status. Their judgment had always stung. But after the divorce, it felt like they treated me with open disdain. Linda's coldness extended even to Ben, as though he, too, were a reminder of some mistake Mark had made. I could still hear her cruel words echoing in my mind. Every time she gossiped about me behind my back. Every time she made a pointed remark about my place in society. Caroline, Sarah's sister, had always joined in on the mockery, her own superiority complex evident in every conversation. Now, today, they were all gathering for Sarah's big day, an event that I had no desire to attend, but one that I had agreed to for Ben's sake. I looked down at my simple navy dress. It wasn't flashy or attention-grabbing, and that was exactly how I wanted it. I wasn't there to make a statement. I just needed to get through the day for Ben. As I looked at him, my heart swelled with love and pride. He was the one good thing to come out of all the pain. He was the reason I had kept going when everything seemed to fall apart. All right, then, let's go, I said, taking a deep breath. I had to pull myself together for him. No matter what happens today. Remember, we are family, never forget that. Ben looked up at me. His blue eyes filled with trust and understanding. He nodded, a small, determined smile tugging at his lips. I won't forget, Mom. We left the apartment and made our way to the taxi. As we drove toward the Grand Harbor View Hotel, I couldn't help but feel like an outsider in this world. The hotel was luxurious, the kind of place I had never belonged to. We climbed the marble stairs, passing the grand chandeliers in the lobby, and I couldn't shake the feeling that everyone could see how out of place I was. But I didn't care. Today wasn't about me, it was about Ben. As we approached the reception desk, the staff member hesitated for a moment, checking the guest list before glancing up at us with an uncertain expression. I felt my stomach tighten. The familiar sense of discomfort began to wash over me as I squeezed Ben's hand. We were shown to our seats, and as we made our way into the reception hall, I caught sight of our place cards. Mom, what's this? Ben asked, his voice tinged with confusion. My heart sank as I saw the words printed on the card in front of me. Single mother waitress. Ben's seat, too, was labeled, Single Mother's Child. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to flee, to grab Ben and leave this place behind. But I knew that I couldn't. Not with Ben looking at me, waiting for me to be strong. It's just a bad joke. Sweetie, I said, my voice trembling slightly as I flipped the card over. I forced a smile, trying to mask the storm of emotions brewing inside me. But deep down, I could feel the weight of the humiliation bearing down on me. I sat down, trying to steady my breathing. I could feel the eyes of the other guests on us, their judgment palpable, but I didn't care. For Ben, I would endure this. I would do anything for him. The reception began as I expected, with an overwhelming sense of discomfort gnawing at me. The room was filled with people I hardly knew, all dressed in their finest attire, their laughter mingling with the clinking of glasses and the soft strains of the orchestra. It all felt so far removed from my reality. The chandeliers above seemed to sparkle like a distant world I could never truly belong to. And I could sense the invisible divide between us, the guests who were part of this world of luxury, and me, a single mother, just trying to hold it together for her son. Ben seemed unfazed by the surroundings. His wide eyes took everything in with innocent curiosity. But he stayed close to me, clutching my hand tightly. I couldn't help but admire his resilience. At only 8, he had already been through so much. And yet he never seemed to waver in his love for me, in his need to protect me. The first moments of the reception passed in a blur. The wedding ceremony had been picture perfect. Sarah, glowing in her bridal gown, had walked down the aisle on her father's arm. Everyone had admired her beauty and the love between her and James, the groom. And there, in the midst of it all, was Mark. I couldn't help but notice how different he looked, more successful, more polished, his confidence radiating as he stood next to his new wife. But my eyes were drawn to something far more important, Ben. He was quietly sipping his juice, his small hands wrapped around the glass, his eyes occasionally flicking toward his father. Mark had glanced in our direction a few times, but he had made no move to approach us. I knew this was his way of keeping his distance, of maintaining the distance he had always wanted between himself and me. And now, between himself and Ben, Mom, Dad is looking at us, Ben whispered, his voice barely audible. I nodded, squeezing his hand. I know, sweetie, just ignore him. We're here for Aunt Sarah. Remember? But Ben was a sharp boy, and his observations never ceased to amaze me. He could see what others couldn't. He could feel the tension, the quiet disdain that had lingered in the air since we had arrived. And I could see that it was bothering him. The dinner began, and just as I was about to relax into the comfort of my seat, the sound of a microphone cut through the murmuring of the guests. Linda, Sarah's mother, had risen to her feet. I knew immediately that something was coming. She was always the center of attention, always trying to make sure everyone knew just how important she was. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice oozing with the kind of false sweetness I had come to recognize. "We have a special guest tonight, our former family member, Emma." All eyes turned toward me, and I felt my heart drop. Ben's grip on my hand tightened, and I squeezed his fingers, trying to calm him, though I could feel my own anxiety rising. "Emma, as most of you know, works as a waitress," Linda continued, her words dripping with condescension. "So, I thought, why not let her serve dinner tonight? After all, that's what she's good at, isn't it?" I could feel my face flushing with humiliation. The room fell silent, the laughter from moments ago now replaced by an uncomfortable stillness. I wanted to disappear. I wanted to stand up and leave, to protect Ben from this cruelty. But then I looked at him, sitting next to me with his wide eyes. And I knew I couldn't. Not now. Not when he needed me to show him what it meant to stand strong in the face of adversity. I held my head high, forcing a smile, though inside I was crumbling. It was as if all the years of judgment, all the insults, all the years of working tirelessly for a life I could be proud of, had culminated in this one moment. I wasn't just being humiliated, I was being reduced to nothing more than my job. My past, a label I couldn't escape. But Ben wasn't going to let this go. I watched as he stood up, his small body moving with quiet determination. His face was serious, his eyes locked on Linda as if he was trying to understand what had just happened. "Mom," he whispered again, but this time, his voice was different, filled with conviction. Before I could stop him, he had already moved toward the stage, where the microphone stood. I felt my chest tighten, my stomach lurching as I watched him walk away. I wanted to stop him, to pull him back to safety. But there was something in his eyes that told me I needed to let him speak. "Ben, wait," I called softly, but he didn't turn around. He walked up to the microphone, his small hands adjusting it carefully. He was only 8 years old. But in that moment, he stood taller than anyone in the room. "I have a present for the bride." Ben's voice rang out, clear and steady. "Actually, she is." He paused, his eyes scanning the room. And then, with a deep breath, he continued, "As most of you already know, my mom works really hard every day. She wakes up early to make my lunch, checks my homework, and then works all day at the diner to make sure we're okay. She never complains. She never stops smiling." I felt my heart swell with pride, a lump forming in my throat as I listened to my son defend me in front of all these people who had never truly understood me, let alone respected me. Ben looked around the room, his gaze steady. "Nobody has the right to hurt her," he added, his voice growing stronger. "She's the best mom in the world, and no one should make fun of her. Ever." There was a stunned silence that followed. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. But before I could process it, I saw Caroline's face turn pale. The groom, James, looked confused, his eyes darting from Ben to Rachel to Mark, who was now standing, clearly uncomfortable. But it wasn't just the shock that hit me. It was the clarity in Ben's voice. For the first time, I felt like someone was truly seeing me. Not for my mistakes or my failures, but for who I was. And in that moment, I realized something important. Ben had more courage than anyone in this room. And as I looked at him standing there, facing down an entire room of judgmental eyes, I knew that, for once, it wasn't me who needed to protect him. It was him, in all his childlike honesty, who had just protected me. The room fell into complete silence. I could hear the muffled sound of my own heartbeat in my ears. And yet the stillness that followed Ben's words was the loudest thing I had ever experienced. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped. The guests in the room, all those who had once looked at me with disdain or pity, were now staring at Ben in stunned silence. The laughter had died, the mocking glances replaced by uncertain stares. I held my breath, watching Ben, my son, who was still standing before the microphone. His small frame seemed to take up the whole room, his confidence more powerful than I had ever felt. And in that moment, I knew that everything was changing, not just for me, But for him as well. He wasn't just defending me, he was taking control of his own narrative. He was showing everyone what it meant to stand up for what's right, regardless of the consequences. Ben's words had shattered the silence, and the awkward tension in the room began to shift. Some guests were murmuring, others were looking away, uncomfortable with the truth that had been laid bare before them. But then, in the midst of all this, I heard Linda's voice cut through the murmur of voices. "Ben, sweetheart, this is a special day," she said, trying to sound soothing, but the thin veneer of kindness was evident in her voice. "Let's not ruin the wedding with these childish outbursts. Come on, let's all sit down." But Ben wasn't finished. His small hands gripped the microphone again, and his next words were clear, his voice unwavering. "I overheard Aunt Rachel and Dad talking 3 days ago. I heard them, and I heard everything," he said, his words still carrying that same quiet authority. "I know what's been going on. You don't have to lie anymore." The room fell into an even deeper silence as Ben's words hung in the air. My heart raced, my thoughts a whirlwind as I watched the expressions on Rachel and Mark's faces shift from confusion to panic. "Ben, please." Mark started to speak, his voice low and strained. But Ben continued, undeterred. "I heard you talking about how you were going to humiliate Mom today." Ben said, "How you wanted everyone to know she was just a waitress. Nothing more. But I know who she really is. I know she's the best mom in the world. And I'm not going to let you hurt her anymore." The impact of his words was undeniable. The entire room seemed to inhale in unison. I felt tears well up in my eyes. Not from shame, but from pride. Ben was not just speaking the truth. He was revealing the pain that had been hidden for so long. And in doing so, he was exposing the hypocrisy of the very people who had once held power over us. Before anyone could react, Ben reached into his pocket and pulled out a small smartphone. The device gleamed in his hand, and as he placed it close to the microphone, he pressed play. The recording started, a faint sound of voices filling the room. It was unmistakable, the conversation between Mark and Rachel, plotting how they would belittle me at the wedding, mocking my life, my job, and everything I stood for. I looked around the room, watching as people's faces morphed from disbelief to shock. Gasps echoed through the hall, and the atmosphere became charged with tension. I felt a sickening twist in my stomach, but also an overwhelming sense of clarity. The truth had come out. All the years of feeling small, of being belittled, had led to this moment, the moment when the world would finally see who we truly were. Rachel's face turned pale as the recording continued. She looked as though the floor had been pulled out from beneath her, and her eyes filled with panic. Mark, too, seemed lost for words, his hands trembling as he looked around at the stunned guests. His secrets, his lies, were laid bare for all to hear. But it wasn't just the betrayal that stung, it was the realization that Ben, my son, had been paying attention. He had been watching all of it, even when I thought he wasn't. He had been quietly absorbing everything, the way we were treated, the way they spoke about us, the way they dismissed us. And in this moment, he was showing me something I had never truly understood until now. Sometimes, it's the quietest voices that speak the loudest. Ben's words were still ringing in my ears when James, the groom, stood up. His face was ashen, his eyes wide with disbelief. For a moment, he looked at Rachel as though he was seeing her for the first time, his brow furrowing as the weight of the truth settled in. "Is this true?" James asked, his voice trembling. Rachel, her composure shattered, tried to deny it. She stammered, but her words were incoherent, her eyes darting to Mark as if seeking help. Mark's own face was flushed with anger and shame, but he remained silent, unwilling or unable to speak the truth. I watched as James's expression hardened. He turned to Rachel, his eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and hurt. "I can't believe this," he muttered. You betrayed me with my own brother?" His voice cracked with pain, and I could see the heartbreak etched across his face. In that moment, it wasn't just Rachel and Mark who were exposed, it was the entire web of lies they had woven. The facade they had so carefully crafted for so many years, And just as quickly as it had begun, the entire wedding, the event that was supposed to be a joyous celebration, had become the most painful moment in their lives. As the chaos unfolded, I stood there, watching Ben as he quietly walked back to his seat. The tears in my eyes were no longer from pain, but from pride. My son had done something I had never been able to do. He had stood up to them, to the very people who had treated us like we were invisible. And in doing so, he had changed the course of our lives. We may have walked into that room feeling small, but we were leaving with our heads held high. And as I looked at Ben, sitting beside me, his small hand in mine, I knew that the life we were about to start together would be one of strength, love, and courage. As the chaos continued to unfold around us, I looked at Ben, my son, who was now sitting beside me, his small hand resting in mine. There was a sense of calm between us, an unspoken understanding that this moment, this day, marked the beginning of something new. We had been through so much, yet here we were, standing together, stronger than ever. The tumult in the room started to fade, and eventually, the guests began to scatter, some leaving in shock, others with their heads hung low in shame. Rachel, the bride, remained frozen, unable to speak, while Mark, my ex-husband, stood awkwardly by her side, his face flushed with guilt. James, too, was silent, staring at the scene in disbelief. It felt as if the world had shifted. We had entered that room as the outsiders, the ones everyone looked down on. But by the end of it, we had reclaimed our dignity. We had reclaimed our truth. And for the first time in years, I felt proud of who I was, proud of the person I had become, and proud of the son who had shown me the way. As we left the venue, Ben and I walked quietly through the darkened streets of Boston. Hand in hand, we were heading home, but it felt like we were heading towards something bigger, something better. The future was uncertain, yes, but I knew we could face it together. There were still challenges ahead, but we had already overcome the greatest one of all, learning to stand up for ourselves and to speak the truth, no matter the cost. I hugged Ben close as we climbed into a taxi, feeling an overwhelming sense of love and gratitude. "You're my hero, Ben," I whispered, my heart full. "And we're going to be okay. I promise." As the taxi drove off into the night, I smiled softly. This was just the beginning. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more life stories. Stay tuned for new content that will inspire and uplift you.